want to formally welcome you to today's conversation, our web conference today that is being put on with our partners at Prevention Institute. This web conference is titled Truth, Healing, and Transformation, Addressing Structural Racism and Building Multiracial Solidarity to Prevent Sexual and Domestic Violence. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, sponsored by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the US government, CDC, or Valor US. If you would go to the next slide. So I know we have such an important conversation to get to, and we are going to do that in just a moment, but we could not let this web conference go by without recognizing our partner and our friend at Prevention Institute, Alicia Somji. This is going to be Alicia's last web conference with us. As part of the Prevent Connect team, Alicia is moving on in her career. And Alicia, we just want to wish you a warm farewell. Thank you for all of what you've brought to not only Prevent Connect and our web conferences, but this movement. And we are just, so honored to have been able to do this work with you for the last, I think 5 years. And Zach, if you go to the next slide, Alicia, we did a kind of informal count, and we believe that this is your 30th Prevent Connect web conference today. So not only are we sending you off with our love and gratitude, but also on your 30th web conference. And Tori, I think we want to launch a poll right now. We want to know how many web conferences have you attended that Alicia has facilitated? And so there's some responses, but it looks like, gosh, Alicia, so the bittersweet news is a lot of people may be experiencing your wonderful facilitation for the first time, but you do certainly have folks who have been with us all along the way. So that is so wonderful. We'll go ahead and end that poll. And then Zach, if you go to the next slide, we would just love for you all to know that outside of our web conferences, Alicia has authored many guest profiles of work that folks are doing across the country over the years. We did a really great podcast with Alicia. So anyways, we want to lift you up, Alicia, all the work that you've done. We'll put links to where y'all can find that. And then Zach, if you go to the next slide, the last thing before I officially turn it over to you, and I think a lot of people have already been doing this, but we just want to welcome you all in our audience to help us send Alicia off. So do you want to give Alicia some words of encouragement or wishes? We invite you to do that. And Alicia, I want to turn it over to you and the team at Prevention Institute. And again, just want to express my gratitude. Tori, I also wanted to give you a chance to say something to Alicia.
Sure. Alicia, you have been part of Prevent Connect as long as I have, and you've been a part of Prevent Connect longer. It feels like you bring such an energy and spirit that I'm really going to miss in these web conferences. And you've been such an example of professional, warm, welcoming, authentic facilitation. And I'm really, really lucky and grateful that I got to learn from you and get to know you. And I am going to miss us fretting over technology together in your office when we used to be able to do that.
Thank you all
Tori.
so much.
All right, Alicia.
You all surprised me. I didn't know these slides were coming, and I didn't know I had done 30 web conferences with Prevent Connect. So thank you all. This community really is so special to me, and I look forward to being on the other side as a participant moving forward. So thank you all, and let me introduce the rest of my team here at Prevention Institute. So I'm not alone. Lisa Fujie-Parks, who's been with Prevent Connect from the early days and is a great teammate. Lisa, if you want to say hi.
Hello, community.
And we also have Xavier, who is doing a lot of our text chatting resources and that kind of thing today, newer to our Prevention Institute team. So welcome to Prevent Connect, Xavier.
Thank you. This is also my first of your webinars that I'll have the delight of being a part of.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining. And Zach, who I think has been on a previous Prevent Connect web conference, but also newer to our team and sharing slides today. Thank you, Zach, for everything that you do.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thanks.
So today, as you know, we're talking about truth, healing, and transformation. And I'd like to share our objectives with you, which you probably saw when you registered for this session. But we're going to be describing the links between taking action on structural racism, decolonization, and preventing sexual and domestic violence. We have 3 amazing guests that are working at this intersection who will be sharing their perspectives today. And we want to get into a dialogue all together around what multiracial solidarity looks like. So please throughout join in the chat. I know you've all been chatting a lot already, and we want to keep that going. So we have a question for you here. What are the connections between truth healing and transformation and preventing sexual and domestic violence? Or if that question's too wordy for you, even just, what are the connections between racial justice and preventing sexual and domestic violence? So please do share in the chat and we'll come back to see what's coming up. But I'm going to hand it over to Lisa just to do a little bit of context setting with this all.
Thanks, Alicia. So, hi, everybody. I feel like the introduction to this web conference already from Tori set a lot of the context of what we're talking about today. But just want to talk a little bit more about these 3 interrelated concepts of truth, healing, and transformation. And I want to give credit that this framing comes from Dr. Gail Christopher and the work that she led at the Kellogg Foundation around truth, racial healing, and transformation. So this has been really powerful for me to grapple with. And I really want to start with the truth part. The idea that to create the foundation for the healing and the transformation that we need to name and build a shared understanding that sexual and domestic violence and other forms of violence are rooted in the history of this country. Colonization, slavery, gender oppression, isms, the power imbalances, the harm that have been embedded in our governance systems, our policies, and our norms, and in our own psyches and hearts. To tell the truth that, this false ideology that there's a hierarchy of human value that's operated in this country, and that harms have been committed and continue to be committed, and that a path forward really involves taking account for and taking care of the suffering and loss. And the truth, so it's like multiple truths, right? Not just one truth, but the truth that in every generation there has been healing and resistance and resilience and solidarity and thriving. So grounding in these truths and trying to see through the delusions, the falsehoods, with compassion and courage, and really committing individually and collectively to then the healing work and the transformation work to create the safety, the equity, the thriving communities that we desire. So what are the processes by which we can come together to tell these truths? For me, things like commissions and public art and story sharing and ceremony and renaming buildings and streets and parks and things like that come to mind. And our guests, our wonderful guests today, are going to talk so much more about what that work looks like in the communities that they work with and the work that they do together. So this notion that truth, healing, and transformation are interrelated and necessary processes, that our ability to tell the truth about the past and how it shapes the present is critical for the healing and the transformation and for the future that we want.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing. And I'm seeing a lot of similar things coming up in the chat. So it seems like there's a lot of alignment. I'm also recognizing that the Prevent Connect community is talking a lot about oppression, and it just making me think about language and the different language that different fields use and different, I'm seeing a lot about power and oppression. And I know those are really terminology that's used in the field a lot, and transformative justice. And so truth, healing, and transformation might be newer terminology, or maybe not. I don't know. The other thing I wanted to bring up was someone's comment around the US cannot prevent domestic and sexual violence without first having a reckoning with our historical truths, which I think really aligns with what Lisa was saying. And one other comment around, to me, truth sets the table for healing and transformation. And I know with our guests, we've been talking about, it's not always just like a step-by-step process, but how all of these things can be happening at the same time. So thank you all for sharing in the chat. And with that, I really want to introduce our guests for today, because I know I keep mentioning them and you don't even know who they are yet, unless you read the description for the session. But we have Nina Youssef, who is the co-founder of the National Organization of Asians and Pacific Islanders Ending Sexual Violence. We also have Nina Matthews, the executive director at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. Sorry about that. And Arlene Vassell, the vice president of programs, prevention, and social justice at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. So rather than giving your whole bios, I really want to have you introduce yourselves. And maybe we can start with Nicole. Can you just give us a quick intro?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Mani Dubaneshi Kwanejnakas Migazine Dodane. Again, my name is Nicole Matthews. I'm Anishinaabe from the White Earth Band of Ojibwe here in Minnesota. I've been the executive director at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition for over 19 years. And prior to that, did work in a tribal community in a rural area that served both tribal community and non-native community on sexual violence and domestic violence. And I'm also a mother and a grandmother, and look forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Nicole. Arlene, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Arlene Vassell. I've been doing this work for about 25 plus years, prevention, intervention, all of it, at local programs and at state coalitions, and then now at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm an immigrant, migrated here to the United States from Jamaica. I'm a mother of 2 adult children. I'm a storyteller, healer, auntie, all of the above, and I bring all of that into my work. And as I had mentioned to Alicia before, we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about healing, and I've done my work through those lenses forever, from day one. I never had the privilege to do my work without thinking about intersectionality, without thinking about poverty, migration journey, economic instability, housing security, all of it. So I'm excited about having this conversation because I've always done my work through that lens, much of it after hours. So this conversation will help folks to have the, to do this work during their regular work hours. So thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Thank
Hi.
you. And Nina.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nina Yusuf, and I immigrated to US in 1986 from Indonesia. At that time, actually, I didn't speak English. And I started the work in 1992 as the volunteer for domestic violence hotline. And then doing all kind of shelter work and then sexual assault work both in Indonesia and the US. I'm a grandma and happy to be grandma. And about 10 years ago, with 4 other API, we co-founded NAPISEF because we didn't see any organization that focused solely on sexual assault in API communities. So that's how NAPISEF started. And we are small and mighty. We only have 3 staff, but we've been doing work nationally because we are one of the OVWTA training and technical assistance provider, but we also have international work in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and Guam and Micronesia. And yes, with 3 staff. So I'm glad to be here. And just a note, the way I work is it's always thinking about collective. So it's never kind of like just me alone, but it's looking at the collective and looking into collective liberation in mind. And in terms of healing for sexual violence survivor is to have this wellness beyond self-care in mind. So looking not just like for now, but wellness as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you each for introducing yourselves and bringing your whole self to it, not just your titles and your, roles in work, but also your roles outside of work. So Lisa did start us off today, giving us a little bit of a description of how she sees truth healing and transformation. But I also want to hear from the 3 of you. And so on our next slide, we have a question for all 3 of our panelists, which is, what is the connection between gender-based violence and structural racism, colonialism, and other forms of oppression? And Nicole, can you start us off?
Yeah, that is a big, big question. It's really the way when we talk about violence against Indigenous women, it is rooted in the colonization and the impact of colonization and what has happened to our people and what continues to happen to our people, right? So I'm currently the co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force here in Minnesota, and this is from our recently released report from December on some of the root causes and risk factors for being a victim, for going missing or being murdered. And, really it is the impact of colonization. Many years ago, our children were forcibly removed and sent to boarding schools where many of them were abused sexually, physically, emotionally, spiritually. We just seen, many of you have probably seen the recent news study that just came out over the weekend about 215 children's remains were found at a former boarding school in Canada, right? We have those same stories here where many of our children were taken, but they never returned home. And the ones that did returned home with multiple layers of trauma, right? And then you add on top of that, we were relocated and sent to lands that we were unfamiliar with. And so all of that, and then you look at what happens today, right? Because some people say, well, that happened, years ago, it's time to get over it. Well, what happened today is we don't have, the forcible removal of our children to boarding schools, but we have some of the highest rates of out-of-home placement of our children. And there's minor, reasons for taking our children and putting them into white homes where then they lose their culture and their tradition and their connection to us. We have high levels of incarceration. When we go missing, there's very little conversation about it. And, several years ago when we were doing our research on prostitution and trafficking of Native women in Minnesota, one of the sex buyers said to a woman, "I thought we killed all of you." And that really is the level of violence that we experience every day on the streets, and also the level of invisibility of our people.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, I really like how you connected historical and present day and ending on invisibility. I see in the chat there's some discussion around that as well. Arlene, what's coming up for you with regard to the question?
And my response to the question is just we need to boldly say we can't end gender-based violence without addressing structural racism and other forms of oppression. We just need to face that, right? And then people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color rather, experience structural racism and other forms of oppression on a daily basis, right? So we have to acknowledge the harm and the systems that continue to perpetuate violence against individuals, including survivors of gender-based violence. We cannot, again, adequately address racism, address gender-based violence without talking about anti-Blackness. And oftentimes that's the elephant in the room. As Black people, our historical experiences stays with us. They define who we were, who we are, who we will become. It's a part of who we are. So we have to acknowledge our histories and our stories. They're all connected to this work. We must strive to create conditions and environments where Black people and marginalized communities can thrive, can live, love, work, worship, age, in a manner free from abuse, free from violence, and free from oppression. The open letter that I wrote, thank you for sharing that, is because of our ongoing experiences with this heightened awareness, right? When incidents occurred, incidents that are televised. So I want to bring it back to reality. Once there's this heightened awareness and then it's back to business, right? For Black people, while back to business is disheartening, it also highlights and reminds us of the structures that we work within, the systems that we work within, the domestic violence movement that has continued to cause harm against our communities. So we have to acknowledge that. We have to address that. The blatant dismissal of women of color, Black women in the movement is just unacceptable. And we can't, again, end gender-based violence unless we address the connection. So I'm glad we're having this conversation between racism and anti-Blackness. And lastly, what I'll say to further illustrate the connection in plain language, a dear friend of mine and colleague shared a statement from a survivor. And the survivor said, "I didn't realize how Black I was until I left my home." So until I left an abusive relationship. So I carry that with me. And I also encourage everyone on this web conference to carry those words with you as you continue to do this work and as you continue to ponder the connections between gender-based violence and structural racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. And I hope folks get a chance to read your open letter after this webinar. We shared the link in the chat and it's very powerful. So please do take a look at that. Nina, what's coming up for you?
Just continuing to what Arlene and Nicole mentioned, that it's all connected, right? If we want to see it and we want to see the truth, right? Because again, we have a choice whether to see it or not, because it's actually is plain to see, but the connection between gender-based violence and structural racism, colonialism, and other form of oppression. So just an example, and just lately, the issue of Atlanta, right, shooting. And then all this thing now about Asian hate. And some people are surprised, but it's like, no, you cannot be surprised, because the racism, the oppression, gender-based violence, it's very structural and it's been around for a long, long time, specific to API. If you look into Chinese Exclusion Act, it was 1882. And then, but before that, there was the Page Act in 1875, specific exclusion to banning Chinese women to come to US. So why we are surprised? We should not, because that was like, that is the truth, the fact. And and then we also need to look at the colonialization and the power dynamic of wars in Southeast Asia and what is like the impact of it, right? The refugee camps, that is still there, on the border of Thailand and Burma. And then what is the story of comfort woman? And then once the folk from Southeast Asia came here as a refugee, and then what about deportation? Deported back. So this is beyond that myth of the API is the model minority, but people do not talk about, being deported and being um, reduced in a sense. Just reading about our statement in Atlanta shooting, we put at the root of this violent incident are white supremacy, racism, and patriarchy and sexual violence. So the question is like, when a white man can kill 8 people and be deemed as simply having a bad day. So that's really showing the privilege that white men in America have and continue to have to cause violence and harm and normalize it, right? So looking into how we, the API, reduce and sexualize, and this is like nothing new. So when it's like sexualized, and then that it's become sexual violence, etc., etc.
Thank you, Nina. I think all three of you have really helped show the connections between history and present day and like really naming the issues. And I know a question that, I always have, because, I really want to talk about like, what's the action? What do we do about these things? So I want to ask each of you, how do we address these structural issues and what does truth healing and transformation look like? And Arlene, I want to start with you. And I know we also had a question in the chat for you around what action kind of came out of the letters. Maybe you can tie that into your answer too.
Yeah, so as it relates to what results came out of the letter represents my voices, represents the voices of my sisters, Black women that I interact with on a regular basis. And I carry the content of the letter with me in all spaces. So it is informing a lot of NRCDV's work. It's informing a lot of conversations. If I'm at a table, the contents of the letter is with me. So I'm taking it everywhere with me, and it's informing policies and practices within our organization and how we do our work. So back to the question, how do we address these structural issues? It's not about checking boxes, right? It's not separate things. All of this is happening simultaneously as a people, and I speak for people that look like me. Thriving, healing, and hurting can happen simultaneously. So we can be we can be truth telling, we can be healing, and we can affect real transformation all at the same time. What I would say is that we need to not create new terms and add them to the same behaviors. So no changes, just new terms. And the same behaviors that continue to harm Black people, Black communities, Black children, Black advocates, Black survivors, and Black communities. Truth, healing, and transformation. What does it look like for Black and Brown people? I would say ask Black and Brown people, right? We can't ask 1 or 2 individuals to speak for an entire community, for the collective. Ask Black and Brown people and then be prepared to act, right? So don't ask, don't get the information, and then you don't lean into creating solutions. So for example, a lot of statements have been floating around over the last couple of years based on incidents that we've watched. Incidents that's been televised. I would say, what's the follow-up to the statements? How are you following up to the bold statements? What are you doing? How did you pivot? How are you doing your work differently as a result of the statements that you've put out? And again, the only way I believe to create real transformation is to shift power and resources to the communities most impacted. The communities and individuals closest to the problem they have the solution. And we've learned a lot of this as we've all navigated the twin pandemics that we're going through. Oftentimes, Black and Brown individuals are asked to join tables, right? We need resources to create our own tables, and then we can invite non-Black people to our tables. So again, here and there, you'll hear about that in the letter. That's what I'm referencing. So instead of continuing to invite marginalized communities to your table, create spaces, create resources for marginalized communities to create their own tables, and then wait to be invited to those tables. Black and brown people are often looked upon as doers as doers and not thinkers, and that's represented in our movement overall. And I'm here to acknowledge that we are natural leaders, we're policymakers, we're organizers, we're truth seekers, we are storytellers, we are nurturers, we are teachers, we are healers. We have all that we need for real transformation in our communities. We just need the resources and the space to make it happen.
I'm seeing a lot of agreement in the chat. So that's great. Next, I'd like to ask Nicole the same question. So how do we address these structural issues from your lens?
Thank you. And Arlene, I love what you said about, we need to create our own tables, because we are always invited to sit at someone else's table, right? As the token XYZ person on that table. And oftentimes all the decisions are made before we get there, but they want, someone like us to come and rubber stamp their ideas. So I love what you said about that. Thank you so much. I think there's so much, right, in addressing some of the structural issues. I would, invite all of you to think about what you learned about Indigenous people when you were in school. What do you even know about us? We are often talked about as if we only existed 500 years ago. There's very little about our current reality, about who we are now, and about our contributions to not only the, where we are today, to the makeup of today, but also to all of our contributions currently, in the ways that we, like Arlene said, all of those roles, right? Like all of the ways that we take on leadership, all of the great and wonderful things that we are doing in our communities. Minnesota is home to 11 federally recognized tribes. And for many of you that do sexual assault advocacy work, you know that you have to have many states, or most states, I think, have a certain number of hours of advocacy training you have to complete in order to be a certified advocate, so you can have privileged communication with your clients or the survivors that you're working with. Well, a number of years ago, when we were looking at those guidelines of what our advocates are trained on in Minnesota, there's required training topics and there's optional. And the tribal stuff was optional. So we have 11 tribes in Minnesota. We have one of the largest urban Indian populations, and it was only optional to know anything about us. So what does that say, right? About the commitment to really serve the Indigenous people of this land well. And so when we're looking at all of those systems, going back to the issue around missing and murdered Indigenous women, one of the systems that we looked at is media. And oftentimes when a Native woman goes missing, we would see her mugshots. We don't see, for white women, we see very flattering pictures of who this woman is, right? And for Native women and for women of color, we often see, let's dig up some dirt to find about how we can blame her for her disappearance, right? And so we would see mugshots, we would see pictures that were not so flattering, that is a way to dismiss us, and is a way to not have to respond to us, or even to care if we're found, right? Or to care about our lives. And it creates this culture of blaming. I will tell you that this week has been raw for me, a little bit raw emotionally for me, because over the weekend, Well, last week I got a call from a father who we helped him many years ago when his daughter was missing and she was a teenager, and she was used in sex trafficking. And I'm not breaking confidentiality because he gave me permission to share his story and plans to share the story. But she was murdered last week, and that is exactly, like our staff talked, and I said, this is why we do what we do, and this is why we will, that I do this work whether I'm paid or not paid. It's about showing up in community for each other. It's about holding systems accountable, right, to respond and to respond appropriately. It's about, what do our systems of healing look like? What is the accountability for our nonprofits and our community-based organizations when they're responding to victims who are whether they're trafficked or whether they're victims of sexual violence or domestic violence? Like, how are we showing up? How are these systems accountable across the board? That's what I think about when I think about structural issues, is making sure we have that accountability, and the accountability for all people that are most impacted, because oftentimes we build systems that work for the general population, and what that means, or mainstream, that means for white people, and it doesn't mean for us. Those systems are not accountable in the same way for us. So how do we build those systems that are accountable, and how do we make sure that we continue to hold them accountable? So
I appreciate you grounding us in reality and sharing what's been going on. And I see a lot of, comments around heart going out to the family and that sort of thing.
And I think just one more thing, the other thing that I want to add, because I think what is also really important for us as relatives to each other, and I wore my be a good relative, and because I do believe it is about how we are good relatives to each other, was that we went and supported that family and went, it's a holiday weekend, everybody's got the weekend off, they have barbecues planned and this and that, and we showed up in community to be with that family for 2 days through their ceremonial funeral, because that's how we are. That's what it means to be a good relative to each other, and how are we showing up for each other.
That's so important. And I hope we can return to that in our conversation about multiracial solidarity. How do we show up for each other, in multiracial ways as well? Nina, how about for you? How do you think we address these structural issues?
About the truth, connecting the truth, I want to bring or refer to our listening session report. This is probably similar to what Arlene said. We have the answer, and here is the title of the listening session: is "No One Can Tell Our Story But Us," a dialogue on sexual violence in API communities. So, we are the one and who can like peel all this issue and expose it and saying the truth, and we actually know what the answer is. So I always say, can I step aside, just give us the just step aside and let us lead, let us move, because I think what you all, I think Arlene and Nicole said is, we are usually not invited, right? So whether it's funding, whether it's voices, sometimes we don't have access to it. So in the report, the main issue is actually naming sexual violence. So the truth is naming sexual violence, what it actually is, and what is the root cause of it, and once we can take a look, it's actually, we will understand it's systemic, right? And it's not like individual. Yes, there is individual, but a part of it is systemic. And the truth also means exposing how the system works in maintaining that oppression. So there is the whole system that is maintaining the oppression, and then in API, sometimes it's through militarism. So how does this actually, how does it connect to sexual violence? Militarism, you can see where is the US military base, right? It still exists until now. And then what does it mean with sexual violence that connect to that? What does it mean that is connect to sexual violence in military? So it's still going on. It's not something in the past. About healing, unpack what healing means, as the term is overused. So we have to come back to our culture and ask the question, what does healing means for you? Because what happened is we often kind of like follow the mainstream ways of doing our program, our own ways, but then at the end it won't match, because that's not what we mean with healing. So in APISEF we always ask, like, what do you mean by healing? So because once we know what healing means for me, then I can put what kind of strategy for me to arrive to that part, right? Healing approaches in culturally specific contexts, rather than kind of like Western centered approach, to have more like community and cultural perspective. So this is like one thing I've been studying or learning about my own culture in terms of like philosophy. And what I found out is in Indonesian or Japanese, there is no me. So there is no ego, just like one person, but it's always me as it relates to the collective. So even if I want to do something, I have to think about the collective. And I think this is very similar to in the Native community, relative. So so you are not like alone. Whatever you do, you have to think about your family, or relative. And then the other thing is healing practices that accessible for survivor and community members. So if healing it's always connected usually with talk therapy or like yoga or things that people need to put kind of like money to pay, and then the question is it accessible to our community? So when we do program, when we want to support healing in the community, we have to ask whether it's accessible or not, right? And in our report, it say actually healing means creating safe spaces where folks can talk about body, about sex and sexuality and sexual violence without being shamed. So spaces that we can unpack, because I think it's really hard in our community to talk about sexual violence without really talking about sex and sexuality. It's kind of like jump. While we usually in our culture, we don't talk about sex and sexuality. So to kind of like unpack that sex and sexuality, and then we can talk about sexual violence. And about transformation, I'd like talk about the fact of who we are. It's compiled usually Asian, but we are more than Asian, because I think in Asia there is no word of like Asian, because we are all different, and also when we talk about API, without being sexualized, right? So we are as who we are, or not being reduced into these people, quote unquote, who work in the nail salon or owning liquor store or gas station. It's because often that's the opposite of this model minority. Is actually we are reduced, while yes, we are leaders, we are thinker, and many more, but it's often reduced and sexualized.
And
Then
Nina,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I know when you were talking about healing, you really talked about the importance of listening and, defining healing in the ways that communities want to define them. And I'm wondering if we can actually get to the accountability piece. Like, how do you think about accountability and justice?
Okay. So the accountability, it's not so much, I mean, accountability, we have to ask, like, what is accountability? So we have to ask the survivor or ourselves, what does accountability look like for you? And often what we find out during the listening session is that it's not so much about criminal justice, because for sexual violence survivor, often criminal justice doesn't really work. It's too traumatizing. So one of the example is when we ask, what does justice mean for a survivor? And what she said is, justice for her was to be acknowledged that the assault happened, the rape happened, and uh, she wants like support. That's all justice means for her. So sometimes it's not as complicated as what people think. So that can be actually facilitated. And when we talk about restorative justice, transformative justice, uh, again, work with the community because they know the answer. In our culture, we have circles, that we can discuss. We can appoint people, and kind of like working with elders. And so it's not kind of like a cookie cutter in a sense, but at the same time, still holding the harm doers accountable. And then this is what is hard is, what if that harm doer also a survivor, and this is harm doer also in the community? So how do you work it out, holding the accountability, but remember that we are a collective. So if he is or she is or they are part of the collective, then how do you hold accountability?
Yeah. And I know there are whole courses on this and whole trainings on this, and we're just getting a bit of a teaser, but talking about these different forms of justice and accountability, I think are really helpful. What about for you, Nicole? What's coming up when you think about accountability and justice?
I love what Nina was saying about, what if a harm doer is part of the community? And, also the not wanting, the over reliance on the criminal justice system, right? Which fails our communities over and over and over again. And we have some of the highest rates of incarceration. And yet, the stuff that we have asked to have justice for doesn't happen, right? So, so I wanted to just say a couple things too about these pictures. The one on the right, it was our first in-person event since the pandemic hit. It was just this past May 5th, the National Day of Awareness on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And we did an art installation on our state capitol lawn, and we put 3,000 cardboard red dresses on the capitol lawn. As a reminder, when lawmakers looked out their windows because their session was coming to an end, and they were having some in-person sessions, as a reminder of their commitment to the Indigenous people of this land, of the first people of this land and of this state and of this country, and to raise that invisibility and to raise the awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And we've really had so many conversations about what does, community accountability look like? What does, moving away from the criminal justice system, right? Because it hasn't served our communities well. And so looking at, yes, we know that the harm doers, if they are incarcerated, they're coming home. right? Because our communities, our tribal communities, are small communities, and there is, like Nina was saying, there's so much connection between, communities of color, but there's no, it's not just about me, right? Because there's the collective we, and we have the community. And so what does it look like to hold, for a community to hold an offender accountable? And what does, we have this notion of reciprocity, right? So for instance, if I go, one of the things that we do in the late summer is harvest blueberries, right? And then we harvest wild rice. So before someone goes out to pick blueberries or to harvest wild rice, they would offer their tobacco. And it's about that give and take, right? It's offering that prayer to the land, to that berry plant, for giving that nourishment to us, right? And so it's all about the give and take. So when we think about accountability, where's that reciprocity? How does that offender, how does that person, harm doer, whatever we want to, the label, how do they make amends to the entire community? What does that look like? And how do we build systems of justice where they are not only thinking about the one person, the one individual that they harmed, but about that family, about that community, about the whole system, and making amends and making it right to the whole community. So that's kind of the stuff that we have been thinking about when we think about, what is accountability and what is justice, and then really wanting to make sure that, when we look at all the policies that are made, right, like that they are always thinking about the accountability back to the Indigenous people of this land. Many years ago, I think 17 years ago now, I went to New Zealand and met with the Maori women there. And we got to go to their parliament. And one of the things that we learned was that they have an entire office to make sure that every policy that they put forth in their parliament, that they're upholding their treaties. That is like, I can't even imagine what that would look like if we did that here, right? And so to think about, how are we always upholding like our promises that we made, and how do we move forward with that?
And at Prevention Institute, we've really been talking about how community accountability supports prevention. And, we really see it as important as part of prevention, because it's really changing the culture, making these issues something that we're talking about, seeing as a public matter, not just something that's private, and, really changing the culture around gender-based violence.
Absolutely.
And Arlene, what's coming up for you when you think about accountability and justice?
As we think about doing our work, I would say, like the slide says, no survivor justice without racial justice, right? And we just cannot rely on asking one or two people, like Nina and Nicole said. We have to go into communities, right? We have to talk with communities. Accountability and justice looks different for individuals and for communities. So we have to go in and talk to communities. When you ask me personally about what accountability looks like, I go directly to systems, right? There's so many systems that needs to be held accountable for the harm that they continue to cause to Black, Indigenous people of color. And as a movement, we can't turn our heads and continue to pretend that it's not happening. And we cannot continue to play nice in the sandbox with these systems that continue to harm our people in our community. So for example, Black people continue to be killed in their streets, in their homes. Black women continue to die during childbirth. The ongoing harm and trauma that's caused to children in the school to prison pipeline. Black men continue to get thrown away like dirty rags. Zip codes continue to dictate and predict the well-being of our children and our elders. That's our word, right? So what does accountability and justice look like when we know all these things are happening around us? For me, it's dismantling these systems, is undoing relationships with systems and individuals who we know continue to harm Black people and Black communities. Is reparation, is creating spaces and conditions and environment for Black people to heal and thrive? And lastly, how can we create environments where every Black girl can reach their full potential, free from violence, free from abuse, and free from bias?
Thank you, Arlene. And I like how you're expanding the sectors to like beyond even just the usual suspects of sectors that we think about. And, you mentioned about Black women, during when they're giving birth, or like thinking about the healthcare sector and just things beyond maybe the usual ones that we're talking about, like criminal justice.
Mhm.
So we want to ask a text chat question for our audience. You've been hearing the guests so far today, and I want to hear from you about what actions should folks in the movement take to support truth, healing, and transformation, whether it's something that you've already been doing or something that you want to happen. Just what kinds of actions do you think would really support? And I want to ask a similar question to our guests, which is what are kind of some recommendations you might have to support truth, healing, and transformation? And Arlene, I'll start with you.
Okay. So at NRCDV for the last couple of years, we've been having conversations with women of color in the movement to talk about the overrepresentation of white women in the movement and the needs and wants of women of color who are passionate about ending gender-based violence, and at that intersection that we're talking about. So we've been talking about issues, barriers, problems, and most importantly, we've been talking about solutions. Right. So for this conversation, I'm offering the following recommendations that's on the screen. But before I do that, I want to thank the women of color whose voices and lived experiences are reflected in these recommendations. Much, much gratitude for the emotional labor that was required to share their lived experiences and co-create these recommendations. And these will be available far and wide in a few months. And just follow us on all our social media platforms and you'll be the first to get the information. So the first one is just naming it. Oftentimes we've talked about the underrepresentation of women of color. The group decided that we want to change the narrative and really talk about the overrepresentation of white women, because what that does, it then shifts the focus to put the onus on white supremacy rather than the perceived deficits of women of color. Again, create flexible funding so that women of color can support current and aspiring leaders of color to do what they need. Like Nina said, we have the solutions, right? We know the problems, we have the solutions, we just need funding to do that. And then again, I had mentioned earlier that women of color are perceived as doers and not thinkers. We are recommending that we increase the opportunities for women of color to participate in strategic planning and decision-making within our organization and the larger movement. We should also learn from and collaborate with other radical social justice movement because this issue about racism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy is not only in the domestic violence movement, and other organizations have had concentrated efforts on how to address these issues. And then of course, develop succession planning, do succession planning for the gender-based violence movement as it relates to white women currently being in leadership roles. What does that look like? And then I'll skip, because I know we have some time limitations, towards trauma stewardship and creating conditions, and Nina talked about it before, that encourages wellness, right? We talk about self-care a lot, but we don't focus on wellness, and we don't talk to individuals. We don't talk to women of color to find out what do they need in order for their mind, body, and soul to be well. So I'll stop there and I'll just say, the recommendations will be coming out to the field, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. We're creating a webpage that will have the recommendations and resources, and it'll have the journey of how we got to the recommendations there. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. And these slides are also already posted, so if you want to look back at these, they're up as well. Nina, for time's sake, could you maybe just share like one thing in terms of, what the movement can do to support truth, healing, and transformation?
It's what is important is naming it and naming it correctly. So is it Asian hate or is it Asian racism? are we reducing again and again, you know, and naming it what is sexual violence, because it's still the issue. And then echoing on Arlene is creating counter narrative. So change the narrative, how things look like from our own perspective, and then map it out. And you will see how the resource is actually in balance when it's shared.
That's great. And Nicole, how about from you?
Well, I think it says right there, you know, like it's about supporting Indigenous women. And you know, we don't only live, in fact, the majority of us do not live on our reservations, right? Like more than half of us live off the reservation. And so one, it's about recognizing that we are your relatives. Our kids are going to school with your kids. Like we are in your neighborhoods. And so, you know, it's about including us. It's about seeing us. It's about, you know, going back to that virtual table, right? And it's not only about that tokenizing invitation to your table, but it's about going back to like the reciprocity. And if you want me to show up for you, then I need you to show up for me, and I need you to build relationships. And that means, you know, showing up during the hard stuff too, you know, showing up when things are challenging. You know, I just believe so much that, you know, that most of our relationship building happens long before there's a grant that's due, long before we put those tables together. But it really is about showing up in community. It's about having those hard conversations and standing with each other.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people have been sharing things in the chat as well. Lisa, is there anything you'd like to share from what's coming up in the chat?
Yes, sorry, it took me a minute to unmute myself. A lot of great things coming up in the chat. People are talking about sharing space, how important representation is, people having positions of power in the movement, talking about owning histories of harm, intentionality and transparency to repair and center equity, language justice, how important it is for this work to take place in our own workplaces, in our systems. A lot of really good comments that reinforce what our speakers have shared and really kind of reflect people bringing that to their own work and workplaces.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm sure a lot of these things are also showing up in the recommendations that Arlene mentioned, because I see a lot of head nodding going on over there. So we want to ask one more text chat question as well and have our guests speak to this. You know, the title of this session is also around multiracial solidarity. So we want to ask you about what in wherever you're located, what has multiracial solidarity looked like? If you've seen examples of it, we would love to hear what that's been. And then for our guests, you know, we want to hear from you. What does multiracial solidarity look like in communities and in the movement? And we'll start with Nina.
So I think start with thinking about collective. Again, it's not just about you, but the collective. So in this case, we are thinking about collective liberation. So it's not just about liberate ourselves, but also others. And that with taking the first step, looking at your own racism first, because in the API community, we do have racism, right? And colorism. So we have to take a look at that first, acknowledge it, work on it. And then looking at the intersectionality, how oppression actually plays out in different communities. And then find commonalities and then start reaching out and working together. I think work together is like the key. So it's not just in your head, it's a theory, but really working with different group.
And I think the looking at your own racism first is so important too. So thanks for calling that out. Arlene, what about for you? What does multiracial solidarity look like?
So before I go into my response, I just want to bring these names into this space, right? So Pearlie Gordon, age 93, Michelle Kasuk, age 50, Tanisha Anderson, age 37, Natasha McKenna, age 37. Her last words were, "You promised you wouldn't kill me." Maya Hall, age 27, Alexia Christian, age 26, Joyce Cornell, age 50, Ralkina Jones, age 37, India Kager, age 28, Keisha Michael, age 31, Corinne Gaines, age 23, Deborah Danner, age 66, Michelle Shirley, age 39, Carlina Lies, age 30. DeCynthia Clements, age 34, Pamela Turner, age 45, Atana Jefferson, age 26, Breonna Taylor, age 26, just to name a few. And if we're talking about multiracial solidarity and you don't know those names, you should know those names, right? Because we can't do gender-based violence without addressing the other injustices that's happening in our communities that's causing harm to Black women. And just to make it clear, like Nina and Nicole said, like my liberation is connected to their liberation. So all of our liberation is connected, and the only people that benefit from Oppression Olympics, which we often play, are the oppressors. It's a part of their plan. We have to show up for each other on a consistent basis. And for non-Black individuals, you need to start talking about anti-Blackness in your communities, in your organizations, in your institutions. How do you benefit from anti-Blackness? What are you really ready to let go? What is your role in condoning violence against Black people? What is silence and lack of action is really equating to alignment with the oppressors, right? So we need to start confronting racial biases in this movement, in our workplaces, in our communities, and start talking about anti-Blackness.
And Nicole, I know that you mentioned when we talked earlier that talking about anti-Blackness is something that's been happening in your work. Do you want to share about that and also your additional thoughts on multiracial solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really critical for us to talk, in tribal communities, to talk about how anti-Blackness shows up in our communities. There's a real reason why our communities were pitted against each other, right? Because if we stay separate, we will never build power together, right? But that does not excuse us from dealing with our own shit. Excuse my language. Like, we have to have those conversations about anti-Blackness and how it shows up in our tribal communities, because it does. Last summer when George Floyd was murdered, and I live in Minneapolis, and it happened not far from my house. There's been a lot of conversations that have happened, and I've seen a lot of ways that our communities stood up in solidarity with each other. And I think we need to do more. We need to continue to build that, right? Not only in those moments when something happens, but in the quiet moments too. Not only when someone's looking, but when the cameras are turned off, right? Not only on social media, but in the streets and in our communities and in our homes, and all of the ways, and in the policies, all of the ways we have to show up for each other, and we have to have those conversations. I think I'm really grateful to be in an organization that we're not afraid of having hard conversations, conversations that other people don't want to have, and we're okay pushing it a little bit farther and a little bit farther each time. And also to talk about the intersectionality that lives within each of us, right? Many of us, I'm, Native, and I'm Chinese, and I'm white. And so we have intersecting identities within ourselves, right? And so what does that look like when there were the murders down in Atlanta of Asian women? Like, that hit me different than maybe it hit some other people on my staff. And so having those conversations about what does that mean, and how are we are we showing up for each other? And again, going back to being a good relative with everyone. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not easy. It's not going to be easy work, and it's not going to be the kind that happens on social media so we can pat ourselves on the back. It's going to be the real get your hands dirty kind of work. And some people are going to have to step back from leadership positions and let other people that need to lead.
And I think each of you has really given some good recommendations and learnings to support the work of, those of us who are attending today. And hopefully there's some things that you're interested in diving deeper into. I'd like each of our guests to share, what is your call to action for all of us here today? And what is some food for thought to reduce harm? And Arlene gave this language around like food for thought to reduce harm, because maybe you aren't quite ready for the action, but what can you be doing to reduce harm? And I really liked that. So let's start with Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, I think, all of what has been, said, and really when I think about call to action, sometimes we are at a place where it starts small and it's about having conversations with our family members or the people that are closest to us. And then, expanding out, like it's about the auntie that says something really harmful and having that conversation with her, right? And starting there as a practice to have conversations in other communities when it gets bigger. And then as we look at, what are our policies look like, and how have we caused harm? We have to look at ourselves, because there's been times that all of us have caused harm. And so taking a look, I think, internally, and taking a look at, how are we having those conversations with those in our circles, whether we're at the place where it's in our immediate circle, or whether we're going out.
What about for you, Nina? What's your kind of call to action, food for thought?
It's understanding that the relational nature of this work and how it's connected. We are all connected, and the issue also connected. And to see the issue like the truth. So don't sugarcoat it. Just see it as it is. I know it's need bravery. I know it's not easy, but like what Nicole said, have a conversation, with your family first. Unpack the racism, the harm, the trauma. Even if it's hard, do it. Step by step. And another thing is again that this Asian racism is not new, and some of a lot of organizations actually have been working unpacking this, supporting survivor for a long time. See them, acknowledge that they've been working on this issue, and support them. And another thing is bring the youth into the movement, because I think they have a different way of looking at the issue, and I think they have a different trauma experience than us, so can see things differently. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the point around connecting to those who have been doing the work over a long time, that's so important, because it's not about just trying to start something new. There are people who have been doing this. And I know Arlene mentioned earlier around connecting to different movements, and I think there's so many opportunities there. Arlene, what's your call to action and food for thought?
All right. So for Black women and people of color that's participating, I would say create your wellness plan, reevaluate it, reassess it often. Recently, I participated in a webinar, and the sister said the only person who benefits from our demise is the oppressor. It's a part of their plan for us not to be well. So create a wellness plan. I'll start with that. And then I'll say, believe Black women, trust Black women, and listen to Black women. Food for thought. What are you willing to let go? And who are you willing to become in order to achieve multiracial solidarity? Acknowledge the contributions of Black communities, acknowledge the ongoing contributions of Black women in the movement. And again, food for thought. Ask yourself, how are you contributing to the dismissal and silencing of Black voices, Black joy, and Black leadership? And lastly, I'll end with a Maya Angelou quote: do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. So, how can you be better now that you know better?
I love that quote. That's a great ending. We have a couple of minutes here, and I saw one question in the chat that I thought we could try and unpack a little bit. So someone shared about working at an organization that's all white people, and they are also white, and that they're saying it can be really difficult to get people to confront their own biases without people getting defensive, and wondering if anyone has any suggestions about how to approach this issue. So I just wanted to open it up to our panelists to see if you have anything to add. And there was already some suggestions in the chat, like looking into courageous conversations, and there were some other things there too, but any thoughts?
I always look at conversations like those as, we talk about, for those of you who might work with youth, you always think about like teachable moments, right? It's all about ways that we grow. And it's all about, and I think those conversations, they might be painful, but how many have ever experienced growing pains when you were a teenager and you were growing, right? Like growth doesn't come without some sort of pain, even a minor little growing pain. And so they're all opportunities for growth to be better than we are. Like, the beautiful Maya Angelou quote that you just read, and to grow into our higher selves, I think. And so, to have conversations, and maybe, it's a conversation with a couple of people, I don't know, but I always look at it as opportunities for growth, to grow as individuals and also with your organization.
And in addition to what Nicole said, I would add, find your people. Who are your allies? Who are people that think like you do? They might be outside or inside your organization, and start strategizing, right? So reaching out to organizations that have similar situations, and find your people. I say that to everybody. Find your people, because your people will help you through all of this. Yeah.
I agree with Arlene. I think find someone who can understand your people, right? To understand the culture. So then you know how to kind of like facilitate the conversation. These people know the nuances. So that's important.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of suggestions in the chat too, like working with an outside consultant or bringing in presenters, thinking about maybe more the root of the problem, like how can you hire more people of color? So many ideas, even among this group. So hopefully that's something we can continue to make. Hopefully the Prevent Connect community can be each other's people, and we can be good relatives to each other. So to close us off today, we want to share some resources that came up across our web conference today. So, we have Arlene's open letter, and Arlene, I know you shared this other resource. Do you want to just mention what that is?
One of my colleagues, Yvonne Ortiz, wrote this piece, and it's available on Vonet, and it just talks about, as women of color, how do you find your place in the movement? And a group of staff members went to Race Forward and Facing Race and reflected on that and shared a lot of resources. So just something for women of color and for others who may be interested in being better.
That's great. And then we have the Minnesota report that Nicole was talking about. So if you want to dive deeper into that, you can check that out. And Nina, do you want to just mention what this one is, the Peace Canoe Healing Curriculum?
Oh, that's So please check out our website, and we also we have curriculum is responding to sexual violence through I think different ways. And one of this is the example of what it's kind of like healing program look like. So this is by Mylene Kahamik. She was one of the consultant, and what she did is actually really carving a peace canoe, and then invited folks, adult and children, to kind of like work together. So that's you can check out on our website.
That's great. Yeah. And I know, Nina, you talked a lot about defining healing and the different ways that people define it. So it's cool to see these innovative, different ways of not thinking about healing, not necessarily, as we were talking about, mainstream ways or that kind of thing. We also have some other resources from Nina's organization. I know she mentioned the response to the shooting in Atlanta. And on our next slide, I know there were a couple other resources that we talked about regarding definitions of justice and community listening sessions. So all of those are being linked in the chat for you. And with that, I just really want to thank all three of our guests today for, sharing so much with us. And from the chat, I can really tell people appreciated this conversation and found it very valuable. We had a lot of thank yous. So thank you to all three of you, Arlene, Nicole, Nina. Really appreciate you taking time to be here with the Prevent Connect community and for being part of my last Prevent Connect web conference. So thank you so much. Or last one where I'm facilitating, not last one that I'm participating. Thank you all. And on our last slide, we just have our Prevention Institute and Prevent Connect websites links for you. And I will hand it off to Tori and Ashley to close us out.
Thanks, Alicia. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We will be getting the recording up, hopefully by the end of the week, but if not, early next week. You all will get an email when that is available, and the PowerPoint slides are available right now. So thank you again. We'll also be sending a brief evaluation survey to your emails in about 15 minutes or so. And at the completion of that, there is an option to download a certificate of attendance. So if you are looking for that, that's how you can get it. But we just want to thank our panelists again, and Prevention Institute. Alicia, thank you so much for a wonderful web conference. Alicia, we will miss you. But thank you all so much for joining us, and this will conclude our session for today. Take care and hope to see you on a future Prevent Connect web conference.